Economics in One Lesson by Henry Hazlitt is a classic treatise that debunks popular economic fallacies. Its main idea is simple. One must evaluate the consequences of economic policy for all groups in the long run, rather than focusing on momentary gains for a few. Through vivid examples, Hazlitt shows how good intentions, government regulation, protectionism, artificial job creation often lead to counterproductive results. It is worth reading this book to learn to see the hidden consequences of economic decisions and understand why the free market is in most cases more effective than government intervention. Over 70 years, the book has been translated into 10 languages and has become essential reading for libertarians and free market advocates. It is an antidote to economic populism. After reading it, you will begin to notice how the good intentions of officials destroy the economy. It is an ideal start for understanding how the world of money actually works. Rule 1, the lesson. The heart of the book is a simple yet powerful idea. Good economic policy must consider the long-term consequences for everyone, not the short-term gains for the selected few. The error of most people is to consider only the immediate effects, ignoring the hidden costs and deferred consequences. Example, when the government saves a failing company, the saved jobs are visible, but the invisible taxes taken from other industries or the frozen innovation due to a lack of competition are not. Economics is a system where any intervention has ripple effects, often contrary to the stated goals. Rule 2, the broken window. The famous metaphor, a boy breaks a window, and everyone reasons that this stimulates the economy because the glazier will get work. But they forget that the money spent on repairs could have gone to new shoes or books, creating other work. Destruction does not create wealth, but only redistributes resources. Wars and catastrophes do not revitalize the economy, they destroy accumulated wealth. The visible activity after destruction is an illusion of progress. Real growth occurs through creation, not repairing damage. Rule 3, the blessings of public works. Government projects, bridges, roads seem like an obvious benefit. But the question is, at whose expense? The money is taken from taxes, which businesses could have invested in more efficient private projects. Example, the construction of a bridge to nowhere creates jobs, but takes resources away from IT startups or medical research. Furthermore, government contracts are often less efficient due to bureaucracy. One must compare not construction versus nothing, but government project versus the alternative use of that money in the private sector. Rule 4, taxes discourage production. Every additional tax is money taken from entrepreneurs who could have created new goods or jobs. High taxes make investment in business growth meaningless. Example, when income tax reaches 70%, as in some countries, it is more profitable for a cafe owner to cut operating hours than to expand. The additional income will be almost entirely seized by the state. Taxes are not a neutral tool. They change economic behavior, often suppressing exactly what they try to stimulate. Rule 5, government lending. When the government hands out soft loans, it distorts the market. The money goes not to the most efficient projects, but to those with lobbying interests. Private banks assess risks more carefully as they lose their own funds. Example, a government farmer support program can lead to overproduction of unnecessary goods, while the free market would have directed resources to in-demand crops. Artificial lending creates bubbles and reduces the overall efficiency of the economy. Rule 6, the curse of mechanism. The fear that machines will take jobs is an ancient fallacy. Automation indeed destroys specific professions, but it creates more new ones. Cheaper goods increase demand, more workers needed in related fields. Example, when automobiles replaced horse-drawn carriages, millions of jobs were created in factories, services, and oil extraction industries that did not exist before. Progress cannot be stopped for fear of temporary unemployment. In the long run, technology increases overall welfare. Rule 7, job spreading. Politicians like to create jobs, but the type of job matters. Forced employment in inefficient industries, for example, manual labor, instead of machines reduces productivity. Example, banning supermarkets from automating checkout lines to save cashier jobs makes goods more expensive, reducing the purchasing power of everyone else. What is valuable is not jobs per se, but the volume of goods produced. Artificial employment is a hidden tax on society. Rule 8, export subsidies. Subsidizing exports to sell abroad cheaply is a handout to foreign buyers at the expense of one's own taxpayers. Companies become dependent on government aid instead of actual competitiveness. Example, when Germany subsidized car exports to the US, American buyers won, but German workers essentially paid for their discount through taxes. Help for exporters often means punishment for one's own citizens. Rule 9, parity prices. Artificially raising prices for agricultural products to support farmers leads to overproduction and rising food prices for everyone. The surplus must be destroyed or sold for a pittance, an absurd waste of resources. Example, in the EU, milk quotas led to the famous butter mountains, while the free market would have automatically reduced production. Price regulation destroys natural market signals, creating the very problems it claims to solve. Rule 10, saving the X industry. Aiding dying industries, coal, textile, freezes progress. Resources get stuck in inefficient production instead of flowing into promising areas. Example, coal mine subsidies in the 20th century delayed the transition to clean energy, and the allocated money could have created jobs in green energy. The economy should not be a museum of outdated technologies. Saving an industry often harms the entire country. Rule 11, how prices work. Prices are the language of the market, signaling scarcity or surplus of goods. Artificially suppressing prices, for example, on rent, leads to scarcity builders. Stop constructing new homes if it becomes unprofitable. When the state sets a price ceiling on gasoline, gas stations begin to economize, cutting staff or closing unprofitable stations. Example, in the 1,970 seconds in the US, gasoline price controls led to queues at gas stations and a black market for fuel. Free prices would quickly stimulate supply growth. Price is not an arbitrary number, but a vital signal that coordinates supply and demand. By breaking this mechanism, the government exacerbates the problem. Rule 12, minimum wages. Raising the minimum wage seems like help for the poor, but in reality, it eliminates jobs for the least qualified teenagers, immigrants, disabled persons. Businesses automate or reduce staff if wages become unaffordable. A cafe, instead of 10 waiters at the minimum rate, hires 5 at a higher rate and installs self-service terminals. Example, youth unemployment in France reaches 25%. Employers are hesitant to hire inexperienced employees due to high mandatory payments. You cannot legally make people more valuable to an employer. This only leads to the exclusion of the weak from the labor market. Rule 13, do labor unions help workers? Labor unions benefit their members but harm others. By raising wages in one industry, they make its products more expensive, reducing demand, and close shops where only union members can be hired. Take jobs from those willing to work for less. Example, when the Air Traffic Controllers Union in the US achieved salaries 3 times above market rate, airlines began to cut flights, reducing the total number of jobs in the industry. Privileges for one group are always paid for by others, consumers or unorganized workers. Rule 14, the sufficient price. Attempts to fix fair prices for goods A, wheat, disrupt the balance. Farmers start growing more than is needed, and overproduction requires new subsidies or the destruction of surpluses. In the 1,930 seconds, the US paid farmers to destroy pigs and plow under crops to support prices in absurd waste during hungry years. Example, in the EU, sugar quotas artificially inflated the price of sugar for decades, until the 2017 reform abolished the system, lowering costs for consumers. A sufficient price set by officials usually turns out to be either insufficient for producers or excessive for buyers. Rule 15, How profit works. Profit is not a reward for greed, but a signal for the correct distribution of resources. High profit in an industry attracts competitors, which eventually lowers prices and improves quality. When the government confiscates excessive profits through taxes, it kills the incentive for innovation. Example: pharmaceutical companies invest billions in drug development precisely because successful drugs bring in profit that covers the cost of dozens of failed trials. Profit is the payment for risk and the engine of progress. Fighting it means fighting the improvement of life for everyone. Rule 16, the inflationary illusion. Wage increases during inflation are a deception. If everyone is given 10% more and prices rise by the same 10%, purchasing power does not change. But inflation redistributes wealth. Those who first receive new money, banks, government contractors, get richer at the expense of those whose incomes rise slower, pensioners, teachers. Example: in Venezuela, during the hyperinflation of the 2010 seconds, officials and the military retained purchasing power while the middle class was reduced to poverty. Inflation is a hidden tax that hits the most vulnerable and destroys savings. Rule 17, the attack on saving. When the government devalues money or confiscates savings through taxes, it undermines the basis of investment. Businesses need long-term investments, but who will save if money loses value? In Argentina, people massively buy dollars or real estate as the peso loses 30 to 50% of its value annually. Example: after the confiscation of deposits in Cyprus in 2013, trust in the banking system was only restored years later. A stable currency and protection of savings are basic conditions for economic growth. Rule 18, the automation demon. The fear that robots will leave everyone without a job has been repeated for centuries. In reality, automation increases productivity, which makes goods cheaper and increases demand for new services. When banks introduced ATMs, the number of tellers did not decrease, they switched to consulting and complex operations. Example: in the 19th century, 90% of Americans were farmers. Today, it is less than 2%. But unemployment has not risen. Hundreds of new professions have appeared, from programmers to fitness trainers. Technology destroys specific jobs, but creates more opportunities than it takes away. Rule 19, the policy of exports. The obsessive desire of countries to increase exports is absurd because real wealth is created by imports, receiving goods that we do not produce ourselves. Export is only a means of payment. When Japan sells cars to the US, American consumers win, getting quality cars, and the Japanese only get paper dollars. Example: in the 18th century, mercantilists forced colonies to only export raw materials, prohibiting manufacturing. This enriched the metropolises, but hindered development. A healthy economy is oriented toward consumption, not export records. Rule 20, equal prices on imports. Protectionism, protective tariffs, protects inefficient industries at the expense of all consumers. If a domestic manufacturer sells steel 30% more expensively than imported, all industries using steel become less competitive. Example: in 2002, the US introduced tariffs on steel up to 30%, which saved 3,500 jobs in metallurgy, but cost 200,000 jobs in the automotive industry due to rising prices. Protectionism is subsidizing the chosen few at the expense of everyone else in a hidden and therefore particularly harmful way. Rule 21, cheap imports. By prohibiting or limiting imports, the state deprives citizens of access to better quality and cheaper goods. Protectionism forces people to pay more for worse products, reducing the overall standard of living. When the US introduced tariffs on Chinese steel, it raised prices for cars and construction domestically. Example: in the 1,980 seconds, Japan sold cars in the US that were better and cheaper than American ones. Instead of banning them, Detroit improved its models, which ultimately benefited everyone. Free trade is not a concession to other countries, but a gift to one's own citizens. Rule 22, export or die. The myth that a country must maintain a positive trade balance at all costs ignores a simple fact. Import is not a drain on wealth, but the receipt of real goods. 19th century England grew rich not because it exported more, but because free trade allowed for the efficient distribution of resources. Example, modern Germany with its export surplus is essentially giving Mercedes and machine tools to the world for free, receiving only numbers on accounts in return. The real goal of trade is not the accumulation of currency, but the maximum satisfaction of citizens' needs. Rule 23, full employment. The obsessive idea of achieving 100% employment at any cost leads to absurdities like banning mechanization or creating useless jobs. In the USSR, full employment meant that 3 workers did the job of 1, and salaries were only enough for bread. Example, when the French government cut the work week to 35 hours, it did not reduce unemployment, but only increased the burden on those who worked. What is valuable is not employment for its own sake, but labor productivity, the ability to create more goods in less time. Rule 24, the stabilization of commodities. Attempts to stabilize prices for raw materials, oil, coffee, through state reserves or quotas always fail. The market senses the balance of supply and demand better than any official. When the EU tried to stabilize butter prices through interventions, it led to the famous butter mountains. Example, in the 1,930 seconds, Brazil burned coffee in steam locomotives, trying to support prices instead of allowing farmers to switch to other crops. Stability, achieved by intervention, always turns out to be the worst kind of instability. Rule 25, government housing. Subsidized housing seems like help for the poor, but in reality, it reduces the overall housing stock. Taxes on commercial housing construction reduce supply, and queues for social housing create corruption. In New York, 40% of municipal housing is occupied by people who are not truly in need. Example, Singapore solved the housing problem not through state construction, but through preferential loans to private individuals. Now, 90% of citizens own housing. When the state tries to replace the market, it usually makes housing less accessible. Rule 26, protection against famine. Export restrictions on food during crises to ensure our own supply lead to the opposite effect. Farmers, deprived of access to world prices, reduce production. In 2008, bans on rice exports in Asia caused panic and a 3-fold price jump. Example, during the Great Famine in Ireland, 1845 to 1849, England continued to export grain from the country. The lack of free trade exacerbated the disaster. Food security is achieved through integration into the global market, not through isolation. Rule 27, our disappearing resources. The panic over exhausting resources, oil, wood, water, ignores market mechanisms. The scarcer a resource, the higher the price, which stimulates the search for alternatives. In the 1,850 seconds, people feared the end of whale oil for lamps, but petroleum appeared. Example, over the last 50 years, proven oil reserves have only grown. Despite increased extraction, high prices made the development of complex fields profitable. The market is smarter than any expert. It automatically finds solutions before the problem becomes critical. Rule 28, the effect of new factories. The opening of a large factory in a city creates the illusion of prosperity. But one must consider where the investment came from. If the money was taken through taxes from other industries, the overall effect can be negative. When Tesla builds a factory with private investment, that is growth. When the state subsidizes a failing factory, that is a waste. Example, the construction of a car factory in Poitiers cost taxpayers 1.5 billion euros, but created only temporary jobs. What matters is not the presence of the factory, but its economic viability, the ability to create value without forced redistribution. Rule 29, how to repress progress. Government monopolies and excessive regulation stifle innovation. When the law protects outdated companies from competition, society loses potential breakthroughs. Railroad companies in the US lobbied for laws against automobiles in the early 20th century. Example: in Germany, the 1896 law required a person with a red flag to walk in front of every automobile, an attempt to protect horse-drawn transport. Progress cannot be planned from above. It is born in the competitive struggle of ideas. Rule 30, the distribution of income. Redistribution policy through high taxes on the rich ultimately hurts the poor. Investments are reduced and jobs disappear. When income tax reached 98% in Britain in the 1,970 seconds, it did not help equality, but only caused a talent drain to the US. Example: in California, progressive taxes led to a mass exodus of businesses to Texas from 2000 to 2020. The state lost 2 million taxpayers. You cannot make the poor richer by making the rich poorer. The true path to equality is through economic growth, not confiscation. Rule 31, bad measures. The pursuit of formal economic indicators often distorts reality. GDP grows after natural disasters due to reconstruction costs, but this does not mean prosperity. When the government stimulates car sales through credit programs, retail sales statistics improve, but at the expense of future debt problems. Example: after Hurricane Katrina in 2005, US GDP grew by $150 billion due to insurance payouts and construction work, although the country's real wealth decreased. You cannot blindly trust statistics. It is important to understand what real processes are behind the numbers. Rule 32, betting on destruction. War economics demonstrates a paradox. Destruction is considered a stimulus for growth. But tanks and bombs do not increase welfare. They only divert resources from the production of peaceful goods. After World War II, many predicted a depression due to reduced military orders, but an economic boom occurred. Example: in 1944, US military spending accounted for 40% of GDP. If those resources had been directed to the civilian sector, the country would have achieved greater prosperity without the war. War is a colossal waste of resources, not an engine of the economy. Rule 33, autarky. The policy of economic self-sufficiency leads to poverty. Isolation from the global division of labor forces a country to produce everything domestically less efficiently. North Korea tries to make its own computers and cars, but its GDP per capita is 30 times less than South Korea's. Example: in the 1,930 seconds, the USSR declared a course toward autarky, which led to a chronic shortage of goods and technological backwardness. The wealth of nations is created through specialization and exchange, not through attempts to do everything independently. Rule 34, the planning of prices. Centralized price setting inevitably leads to shortages or surpluses. Venezuela, in the 2010 seconds, set prices for 500 basic goods. The result was empty shelves and a black market where the same products were sold for 10 times the price. Example: in the USSR, the State Planning Committee set 24 million prices annually. The system collapsed under the weight of its own inefficiency. No official can know the right price, only supply and demand determine it. Rule 35, the inflationary cult. The belief that moderate inflation is good for the economy is a dangerous fallacy. Even 2 to 3% annual inflation reduces the purchasing power of money by half over 20 years. The policy of inflation targeting often becomes an excuse for hidden taxation through the printing press. Example: since 1997, the abolition of the gold standard, the US dollar has lost 85% of its value. What cost 100 then costs 700 today. Inflation is not a natural process, but the result of specific political decisions. Rule 36, credit expansion. Artificial stimulation of the economy through cheap credit creates financial bubbles. When the Fed lowers rates to zero, it provokes speculation instead of productive investments. The 2008 crisis was the result of such a policy of affordable housing for everyone. Example: in the 2000s, the US gave mortgages to the unemployed. A temporary boom was followed by a crash when it turned out that 20% of borrowers could not pay. Credit must reflect real savings, not be created out of thin air by the central bank. Rule 37. Saving the banks. Impunity for too big to fail institutions encourages irresponsibility. When Goldman Sachs received $10 billion in aid in 2008, its management paid themselves $16 billion in bonuses with taxpayer money. Example: in the 1990 seconds, Sweden acted wiser, nationalized problem banks, cleaned them of bad assets, and then privatized them again. Saving failures at the expense of the successful is the worst way to support the financial system. Rule 3038, the gold fallacy. The abandonment of the gold standard in 1971 allowed governments to print money uncontrollably. Gold is not a relic of the past, but a natural limiter of inflation. Over the last 50 years, all world currencies have lost 97 to 99% of their value against gold. Example: in 1913, an ounce of gold cost $20. Today, it costs $2,000, which shows the real devaluation of the dollar. Paper money without a hard backing is a tool for hidden taxation. Rule 39, sufficient reserves. Attempts to accumulate strategic reserves of everything from oil to rare earth metals are economically inefficient. Storage requires costs, and technology changes today's strategic resource may become unnecessary tomorrow. The US spent billions storing wheat that eventually rotted. Example: Japan, poor in resources, became a technological leader by relying on world markets, not autarky. It is safer to develop economic flexibility than to try to stockpile everything for the future. Rule 40, price control. History shows price control always fails. In ancient Rome, Diocletian's edict, 301 AD, set the death penalty for price gouging. The result was a flourishing black market. In the 1970 seconds, Nixon froze prices for 90 days, stores instantly emptied. Example: in modern Argentina, a list of 2,000 socially significant goods with fixed prices is published monthly. The shortage of these goods has become chronic. You cannot abolish the laws of supply and demand. By decree, the market will always find loopholes. Rule 41, full employment. The idea of guaranteeing work to everyone at any cost leads to the creation of artificial jobs. In the USSR, whole departments at factories worked, where employees did not receive assignments for months, simply to be counted as employed. Real productivity fell. Example: in France, the public sector accounts for 25% of the workforce. Many officials openly admit that their work is unnecessary. The real goal is not employment for employment's sake, but the creation of conditions for productive labor. Rule 42, equilibrium in industry. Attempts to artificially maintain a fair balance between industries slow down progress. When the government subsidizes outdated coal mines, it delays the transition to renewable energy. Natural industry imbalance is a sign of healthy competition. Example: in the 1980 seconds, the US saved the steel industry today. Those factories are still closed, and the resources could have gone to the development of the IT sector. The economy is not a museum where all exhibits must be preserved, but a living organism that requires constant renewal. Rule 43, trade quotas. Import restrictions through quotas rather than tariffs are an especially insidious form of protectionism. They create an artificial shortage and corruption. The right to import a product becomes a privilege of the selected few. In the 1980 seconds, Japanese car manufacturers paid $300 for the right to import a car to the US. The money went not to the budget, but to the pockets of intermediaries. Example: sugar quotas in the US make domestic prices twice as high as world prices. 4,000 farmers profit, while 330 million consumers overpay. Conclusion: quotas are the worst form of protectionism, combining all its disadvantages with additional corruption. Rule 44, reasonable prices. The concept of a fair price ignores the actual costs of production. When the state forces farmers to sell milk below cost, they either go bankrupt or reduce quality. In Canada, reasonable prices for medicines led to a shortage of 800 drugs. Example, in Venezuela in 2018, prices for 90% of products were below cost. The result, 80% scarcity in stores. Price is information about real costs. Distorting it means destroying economic coordination. Rule 45, free enterprise. Government regulation under the guise of supporting business often stifles genuine entrepreneurship. Licenses, permits, and inspections create barriers to market entry. To open a restaurant in New York requires 30 permits and $25,000 just for bureaucracy. Example, in New Zealand, starting a business takes 1 day and costs $1. The country has topped the ease of doing business rankings for 5 consecutive years. True freedom of enterprise requires not subsidies, but the elimination of regulatory barriers. Rule 46, the lesson after 30 years. Upon reissuing the book in 1978, Hazlitt states, all the mistakes described are repeating again. Politicians still believe that economic laws can be cheated through regulation. The inflation of the 1,970 seconds was a direct consequence of the Keynesian experiments of the 1,960 seconds. Example, attempts by the Carter administration to stimulate the economy through government spending only led to stagflation, a combination of inflation and stagnation. Economic laws work regardless of whether politicians believe in them or not. The price of delusions always falls on ordinary citizens. This is such a wonderful book. I have compiled a separate list of all the important theses from this book, along with all the techniques and tools, and created a step-by-step action plan that you can immediately implement in your life. You can get all this in my community, Place of Power. There, you will find a detailed text analysis with similar lists for each book being reviewed. The community has already thoroughly analyzed and made available to you hundreds of world bestsellers, with a new analysis released every day. Follow the link in the description and use it.